some basic Zoom etiquette. Perfect, thanks, Kim. Just some basic Zoom etiquette. You don't have to turn your video on, but if you do, that's great. So we can have some folks that we can look at, see who we're talking to. Everyone will be muted unless you're speaking, and we'll all follow the same protocol. And if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat and the panelists will see them and we can see them, save them for the question and answer period. Before we fully dive into the program, I just want to take this time to acknowledge Indigenous lands that I occupy and also the Threatening Change team. We respectfully acknowledge that we are on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Coast Salish peoples, which is of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And for us, especially working in the realm of sustainability, more specifically sustainable fashion, it's really important for us to commit to understanding and walking towards a path of truth and reconciliation together, but also recognizing that fashion is built on a very colonialist structure and it still continues to exploit many different people in the global south and many marginalized people today. In today's talks, I want you to keep that in mind in thinking that how we're intrinsically existing within a broken system. And it's important that we pay respects and acknowledge the land we're currently occupy so we can walk towards a path of reconciliation together. And today's topics, there's gonna be a lot, but we're gonna be trying our best to kind of thread and weave the different intersections together between colonization, globalization of the fashion industry, clothing production, textiles, and also post-consumer use. So these are all different topics we will explore today and that we'll try our best to also answer any of the questions that you may have. Just a quick outline. We're going to be going into what Threatening Change is all about, our values, welcome our panelists. We'll then have a quick presentation by all the different panelists. We'll have a guided discussion with pre-prepared questions, and there's time for you to ask questions at the end. We'll try to end on a positive note, so we'll also have some action items that we'll let you know at the end of the presentations. And a bit more about Threatening Change. This is our mission. We call it 6Fs, which is a feminist, fossil fuel-free fashion future. And our ethos is really focusing on climate justice, racial justice, and also gender equity. And our mission statement definitely reflects that. And we're so honored and happy to be partnering with UBC Sustainability on the second ever UBC Sustainable Fashion Week. And there's many more events coming up throughout the week. There's another one tomorrow, and then there's also 2 more on Friday. So if you're interested, definitely go check it out. We will link all the events in the chat. And a bit about us and our values. We have 5 main values, which is uphold intersectionality, place people before profits. We are a youth-led organization that's for youth and by youth. We also seek to serve and center underrepresented voices, and we really believe in meaningful collaboration. So these are our amazing panelists for today, and I'm one of them, so it feels weird to say that. But we're going to be introducing them later on, and all of us are involved with Threatening Change in some capacity, so it's really great to see the organization represented. We have Namrita Lamba, who is originally from India, and now she's at UBC. We have Janet, who is from Kenya, and she's joining us from Nairobi today. And there's myself, I am joining you from the unceded lands in Vancouver, British Columbia. This is, I guess, my bio, and I'll just quickly go over it. I founded Threatening Change in 2020, and I was inspired after attending the COP25 climate conference. I don't want to dive too deep into about me because you can just read it online, so I'm just going to go straight into my presentation. So this picture I took when I attended the 2019 climate negotiations COP25 in Madrid. And this was during the 1-year anniversary signing of the UN Sustainable Fashion Charter. And at this event, all the industry leaders got up on stage and they're basically talking about what great strides they've made in terms of emissions reductions in the fashion industry. And if you look at this picture, what do you notice? This is supposed to be the global fashion industry, by the way. Yeah, right. And maybe you're thinking the same thing as me. There was only 1 visible person of color, and there was only 2 countries represented there, or just 1 technically in the global south. Most people from Europe and also America. And there were brands from H&M, Zara, Louis Vuitton, Levi's, Puma that was talking about what great strides they made in emissions reduction. And I thought to myself, gee, H&M and Zara and Nike are responsible for a lot of the fashion emissions in the world today. So by saying you're doing better, you're not really doing anything revolutionary. It's like the equivalent if you spilled a glass of water and you said, look at me, look how much better I'm doing. And the audience member all had a very similar mindset to what I was thinking. And there was also no garment workers represented on the stage and no one from the perspective of actual clothing production. And at the COP conference, there was no one really talking about fashion or circular economy other than this one event, and there was no organization seeking to address that. So I set out to found Threading Change to address this exact gap that I saw in the industry that's youth-led, justice-centered, and making sure that we do center underrepresented voices. And I want to be showing you this picture because I think it really puts into perspective just how unjust the fashion industry is. If you look at where most of the clothing is produced in the world, you see that China's a big one, Vietnam is another one, we have Bangladesh, and India is another big one. Now, it's not a coincidence that these are the countries that are producing most of the clothing, because clothing production is mostly producing countries getting past colonialist rule. And what's even worse is that a lot of clothing donations is going to countries where don't have the infrastructure set in place to necessarily reject those donations. And that's a topic area that Jenna is going to be talking about later after Namrita goes into why clothing production is the way it is today. And what's happening right now is that the fashion ecosystem has been set up in a colonialist way so that the countries that you're exactly extracting resources from, most of the emissions are going to be emitted in those countries. So when it comes to actual emissions reporting, it's easy for brands to say, we made great strides in emissions reduction because the countries that they're headquartered in, for example, H&M is in Sweden, that's not accounted for in their emissions reporting necessarily. That's more likely in China, or it's also more likely in India. And what's also happening is that with the clothing becoming more globalized, a lot of traditional methods of weaving, of dyeing, has been pushed out because the mechanization and the industrialization of fashion, which is another problem in the sense that workers not being compensated fairly for their work and still being exploited in mainly those regions of the world. And another really jarring fact is that the USA is currently the largest exporter of used clothing and Ghana's second largest importer, which means that most of our clothing donations, after we're done with them, is going back into the global south. So you have them mainly produced in the global south where you're extracting resources from there, harming their land. They're responsible for the emissions reporting, and it's going into their global gas reporting data, while we in the Western world are consuming it at an alarming rate and then later pushing it back out to the global south once again. So in a sense, fashion is circular, but in the worst way possible. I hope this gave you a bit of a background on how the history of fashion is inherently broken and how that further bleeds into how clothing is currently made and what we need to do to change it. So I'm really, really pleased to introduce Namrita. Namrita has worked in the apparel industry in India for over 11 years, so she's a powerhouse. She currently is with Threading Change as wearing multiple hats, which includes being the Global Innovation Storymap coordinator and also a volunteer. She's also currently doing her MBA at Sauder at UBC. Namrita has also been instrumental in helping introduce us to various different clothing suppliers and producers and brands in India. And she's moving on to, she's also now currently working with Fashion Revolution in Vancouver, which is very exciting. And she's moving on to doing our global story map on the criteria side. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce Namrita.
Thank you, Sophia. That was such a nice introduction. Thank you so much. So yes, this is about me. And then this is a little bit more personal about me. This is just some stuff that I love watching, I love doing. Those are my little cats back in India called Gin and Tonic. Yeah, this is just a little glimpse of who I am. And yeah, we can get started. So of course, Sophia has really laid down the introduction to what I'm going to talk about. I've worked with, suppliers in India for about 11 years. So I've seen how the supply chain and the back end works. And I find this, this picture very impactful because it shows the two contrasting sides, the one side that most of us see, which is when fashion comes to runways and like television and, the stores. And then there's the side where it's actually getting manufactured, which most of us don't realize what goes into that. And that's what's going to be what I'm going to talk about today. So essentially, there are three stages in just the journey of clothes. One is the pre-production stage where all of the designing happens, and it's the stuff that happens in offices. So it's pattern making, costing, making decisions basically. Of course, that is an important area where designers should think about, what the impact is going to be. But the actual impact of this process is, not that huge. So the focus today is going to be the production side, which you can see, has a lot of different steps, which we will actually go through during the presentation. And then there's the post-production, which again, you would be a little bit more familiar with, but I will touch upon it. So if we start with the production stage, there's a little video. I think that's what's next. Yeah. So this is essentially just a map of the of all the steps in production. So I've put this here if you want to refer to this later, but I will kind of take you through these. And yeah, the video will actually, it's not a very heavy video. It doesn't have emotional content. It's literally just like an animated video about what happens. And then I can show you some pictures from actual factories and things like that. So I think, Sophia, you can play the video. I don't think, yeah.
Yes, jeans. Actually, we love them so much that in 2014, we bought 1.2 billion jeans worldwide. That's a lot of jeans. But moving on from our disturbing shopping behavior, let's ask ourselves, what did it take to make each of these 1.2 billion jeans? First, there is cotton. What does it take to grow cotton? As a US cotton farmer, we would use 40% of our budget in fuel and machinery. This is the first carbon footprint of our jeans, emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases. We will spend 35% on fertilizers and agricultural chemicals. Cotton is considered to be the world's dirtiest crop. It consumes 16% of the world's pesticides. 20% of our budget will go on to buy seeds. Sadly, more than 90% of the cotton seeds planted in the US every year are genetically modified. Finally, only 5% goes into paying for farm labor. In the US, this labor force mostly consists of undocumented workers. After the cotton is harvested, the crop is cleaned and usually sent to China, where most of the world's jeans are made. There, the cotton is carded, twisted, spinned, and stretched, and finally transformed into yarn. All these processes are mechanical and require electricity and fuel. The yarn is then dyed with petroleum-based indigo and other substances. The dyeing process uses tons of water. Untreated, the water ends up in nearby rivers, affecting food farming, plantations, and the water supply of cities. After that, the fiber is woven into fabric and sent to factories where it gets cut and sewed, undergoing more than 37 different sewing operations. This can be an extremely complicated process. Sadly, workers in garment factories are still among the lowest paid labor forces in the world. After that, jeans undergo the process of sandblasting, bleaching, acid, and coating to give a finishing look. Throughout dyeing and rinsing, an extra 5,000 liters of water are used. Once done, the jeans travel all the way to the distribution center by boat and truck, probably back to the US. There, jeans are held until transported to stores. So, are we sure that a pair of jeans costs $45? Suspicious, isn't it?
Okay, awesome. So that should have given you a sort of an idea of everything that goes into making clothes. But I will sort of show you what it looks like in real time. So of course, the first stage is the crop, the cotton crop. I'm going to talk about cotton today because of course we have other culprit fibers like polyester and nylon, which are a lot worse because that's actually plastic. But cotton is one of the biggest fibers that is produced in the world. So I'm going to focus this presentation a little bit on that. So essentially the growing phase is the first stage that you saw in the video as well. And it uses a lot of resources. Then it moves to the spinning side where it undergoes a lot of processes to get turned to yarn. That's what happens in spinning. That goes into weaving, where all of these fibers that from spinning, they go and in a weave, they kind of become a fabric. The fabric then is processed and sent for printing and dyeing. Now, printing and dyeing is, of course, another process that causes a lot of harmful impact because of the kind of dyes they use, the kind of chemicals they use, and the way they're processing. The next slide. Yeah, and then when the fabric is ready, it goes into the factories where, where most of the manual intensive, like labor intensive work is happening. And in countries like India and Bangladesh and, the poorer countries, we don't have so much automation. So everything is done by people. And because of the amount of volumes that they produce and, the demand that we have from brands like H&M and Zara, these factories are running, 24 hours. And it's all people who are constantly doing every operation. So there's the cutting operation, there's stitching. You've seen, depending on how complicated a garment is, there are various processes involved, and there are lines of people sitting just for, each process. And then, of course, there's the packing, which is another process, again, produces a lot of plastic. And, we don't really talk about this a lot, but other than the clothes getting manufactured, every single garment goes in a different plastic bag. And so the number of clothes we're actually making is the same number of packets, like plastic bags we're making as well. And then, of course, is the logistics, from where we move to the post-production processes, which are things that we're more familiar with. Sophia, do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah, and maybe the next one as well. So these are essentially at large the post-production processes. So of course, once the clothes are ready at the factory, they get shipped all over the world, where they're then stored in warehouses. From warehouses, they go into stores. And then, of course, with the online order, there's delivery happening. And each of these stages, has a carbon footprint of its own. And the more volume we churn out, and you can imagine, you've been hearing about the supply chain, clogging that's been happening, and especially over the holidays. It's because there's so much being manufactured, back in the developing countries, that, I mean, so imagine the kind of quantity that's actually being produced in the factories. And it's like choco blocking the system, because if there's so much that needs to be coming and going. And if you move to the next slide. So, and yet, if you have imagined how, all of the shipping and, all of the impact of the post-production has, it's just 1% of the emissions of the industry in the process. It's just 1%. So everything that we saw in the production, which is, the fiber production, the garment production, the dyeing, and all of the stages actually produce 99% of the emissions. And that's huge. And just think about the volumes that, brands are producing. I mean, it's the kind of impact from things that, like fast fashion. That's what we speak about when we say fast fashion, is because there's so much volume being produced, and that same amount is, equivalent to the impact it's causing. And just to put it in perspective, I thought that I think, like, this is the negative impact I think most of us are familiar with, but there's the next slide. There's something that, I thought that if you take anything away from today's presentation, is this. So it takes 1 kg of cotton to make 5 t-shirts. That's just 5 t-shirts. And the amount of water that uses to make 1 kg of cotton is actually enough drinking water for one person for 30 years. That's, probably longer than most of us have lived. And that's just to make 5 t-shirts. And I bet, most of us didn't know this, and most of us don't treat 5 t-shirts, with the respect that it deserves, because of the amount of work, labor, resources that go into just making 5 t-shirts. And when we walk into stores like H&M, they're flooded with clothes. And I bet all of our closets are flooded with clothes. And, when you appreciate how much has gone into making it, like you did get glimpses of what happens in the production and how much is produced. And then you have impact, like if you go to the next slides, we have, dyes being just unregulated, being put into water. This is chemicals, People are living close to these areas. There are children playing here. And countries like India and Bangladesh, we barely have any regulations. This is just happening in villages all the time. We, of course, have the labor, which the next slide, people, they work overtime all the time because of the amount of garments they have to make. Their working conditions are terrible. In a city like New Delhi, it gets to 45 degrees in the summer, and summer is usually 5 months long. And people are working 24 hours, because that's the only way for them to make money. So, the big companies, they cash on that. They pay them the minimum wages because they'll take anything, they have nobody fighting for their rights. And of course, there's the pollution, the industrial pollution that happens at each process, which is the next slide. Which, I mean, it's not new to any of us. This happens at every process, including shipping and even in the manufacturing. Next slide. So before I end, I just wanted to show you that all of this that goes into making a t-shirt and how much a t-shirt actually sells for, how justice really makes no sense when you see things like this, because the distribution of what a t-shirt costs in the whole supply chain is so unfair. So, a t-shirt that sells for $14, the cost of that t-shirt is just about $567, which you can see. And the distribution of that $567 is predominantly the material. But if you go all the way up and see labor is 12 cents of the $14 that a t-shirt sells for. That's less than 1% of what the t-shirt sells for. So you pay $14, the labor is actually getting less than 1% of that. And, it's really not any company or industry's responsibility. I think it's our responsibility, because if we don't change our habits and we don't change the way we shop and think about clothes and value them, then, companies want to make profit. That's why they exist. So it's really up to us. You can go to the next slide. So these are just things that I think that we can all do. And even if we do just one of these things, I think it's a start. And, it's difficult to be 100% sustainable. That's true for anything we do. Most of the companies, it's difficult to be 100% sustainable, but that doesn't mean we do nothing. So what can you do? You can invest in good quality clothes, in good brands, in good practices. Research about the clothes you're buying, see if they're durable, if the fabrics are durable, how they've been treated, if they have eco-friendly connections, if they have ethical connections, and definitely say bye to fast fashion. I mean, you've seen what goes into making clothes and what the issues and impacts are. So buy what you need when you need it, and that way you won't mind spending a bit more on it as well. Definitely look after your clothes. Please treat them with respect. Store them carefully, steam them instead of ironing them. I don't think this is something everybody knows, but the more heat you put on your clothes, the less durable it becomes. So it's best to steam your clothes and not really put too much heat. They will last longer that way. And of course, get creative, find funky ways to recycle your clothes or upcycle your clothes. And most importantly, change your habits. Get into the habit of secondhand clothes, thrifting, swapping, borrowing. Get creative with that as well. And there is a nice website called ThreadUp. I think that's the next slide. So this helps you calculate your impact on your unsustainable or your sustainable impact. So it asks you a bunch of questions. It's like a quiz. And then in the end, it gives you a score and it tells you how you can do things better. So this is something nice you can do if you like. And I think, I hope I've tried to cover most of the things that that I could today, but I'll be happy to answer any questions at the end that you have. And I think with this, I'm passing it on to Janet.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Namrita. That was fantastic. And thank you for also providing insight on the process of clothes. I think it's so true that a lot of people just think machines make all of our clothing. We've kind of forgotten the human aspect of it. And it's still a lot of times people making the actual clothing. Next up, I'm so excited to introduce Janet. Janet is an environmental planning and management graduate with a passion for sustainable fashion and landscape restoration. As I mentioned previously, she's also Threading Change's African Regional Coordinator, and she's currently headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya. And Janet's commitment to sustainability began in 2017 when she watched a True Cost movie and went ahead to contest for Miss Environment in home country and won. And she expresses her love for fashion and the environment through actively volunteering in environmental organizations such as Greenpeace and also GLFX Nairobi, and learning how she can impact change in her community. Janet also incorporates her love for crocheting and upcycling projects and loves storytelling through writing. And with that, I'm so excited to welcome Janet.
Thank you so much, Sophia. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you and just to be able to share about clothes, especially here in Africa and in Kenya as well. So I have never actually traveled outside of my country, but I've been able to at least go to different towns within my country, and I've been able to see just how much of fashion waste that we consume as people in the global south. So I think I'll talk about this much later during when you ask us the questions. But I just wanted to say that most of us actually consume secondhand clothes, and that's because it's very affordable for everyone in Kenya, mostly because a lot of the country's population is made up of a middle income people. So going for secondhand clothing makes a lot of sense. And unfortunately, that also comes with problems because a lot of donations come here, and we just don't know. And most of them are in very bad conditions, and we don't know what to do with them. And since a lot of it doesn't get sold, they end up recirculating within the country. And then I happened to talk to a few secondhand retailers, especially in my hometown. And I asked them what they do with the clothes that they don't sell, because it's a reality. There are a lot of clothes that don't get sold because they come in very poor conditions, like they're stained, like let's say like they have sweat stains, blood stains. Some of them are torn, like they have been worn out. And then, so they told me that initially, because they wouldn't want to incur a loss, so they'd rather sell it for little money, but just to be able to at least cover up the amount that they spent in buying those bills of clothes, which I think is unfair, because there's their family to think about at the end of the day, because they did this. It's a business, and they hope to make something out of it, but then they can't. So the only solution is to sell it at a throwaway price. And most times when these clothes have been in circulation for such a long time, and no one is buying them, they end up being dumped. So you most likely will find clothes all over the road when you're in town, or even in dump sites. And then, so it's a pretty messy thing. So I think I'll talk a little bit about how clothes came into our country, and I'm going to speak specifically about Kenya because that's where I have been. So in the 1980s, that's when the secondhand clothing actually started streaming in, and that's because we have a lot of refugees in our country, and initially the clothes that came in as charity donations from the USA, Canada, UK, just to be able to help out these refugees. But then with time, it became a lot, and it turned from being a charity donation to something else. Like, so now the whole supply chain is actually just ending up in Africa. And the thing is, when clothes are produced, it's produced in the global South countries. And I liked what Ajababa said on her past event, I think it was yesterday, and she talked about how it's people in the global South that make clothes, but then our, like, the overproduction and overconsumption as consumers, the whole thing also ends up with the global South people, and it's really an unfair way. And we just hope that we can be able to talk about it and find solutions, or a better way that we as consumers can make better choices, and hopefully what the fashion industry can take in and be able to be accountable for their production. Thanks, Sophia.
Thanks, Janet. That was wonderful. And way to bring in your lived experience. It's true that, you know, a lot of us have treated clothing as a throwaway format, and that's not the way it should be. So I really appreciate what Namrita brought up with ways that we can also take care of our clothing. And with that, we're going to be going into our dedicated Q&A period. So this is question that we prepared ahead of time, but if you have some questions, feel free to put it in the chat. The panelists will see them and we can get to answering them. I'm just going to reshare my screen, so please give me one moment. Okay, so this is the first question. And it says, why is it crucial to use storytelling to push the conversation of sustainable fashion and also clothing production? I think Namrita can take on this one.
So I think part of my presentation today actually answers this question, because, you know, the reason I'm so passionate about it and is because I'm able to talk about it is because I've been there and I've seen it happening, and, you know, I appreciate everything that goes into it. And when I speak to other companies, you know, now that I'm a part of Threading Change, part of my role is to speak to, you know, other companies who have sustainable practices, and to, you know, spread their story and tell what they're doing. So I feel like it's so important when you experience something and you share it, because when you're in a different part of the world, there's no way you can understand it based on, you know, slides or a video or, you know, news. Nothing can do the same job as, you know, when somebody shares their experience, tells you what they've been through, what's the good thing, what's the bad thing, what they're doing to change it, you know, and how it impacts them. And so I think there's no substitute to storytelling, honestly, and personal experience. So that's my take on it, in case Janet wants to jump in.
Yeah, I can add that there are so many forms of storytelling. There's for me, I think the way I think about it, and I'm thinking about it in the context of a local person who wouldn't really be able to understand, why are you talking to me about sustainable fashion? Why do you want me to think about how clothes are made and the impact? I feel like it's important to cultivate this culture of, in a way that is not too complicated, because I'm thinking, if I go to, say, someone in my rural home and start explaining to them, they wouldn't really understand. But I feel like especially for like an African home, we were brought up, say, we learned how to appreciate our clothes. For example, when we were growing up, we would wear our clothes and then they would be kept until the next baby was born. So we learned how to care for these clothes, to mend them when they were torn. I learned how to mend when I was a young girl from my mom and my dad. And I am really grateful for that, because that helps me to see just how much clothes have stories and they have value. And even growing up, I still do that. I still mend my own clothes. And if I'm not able to, then I go to a tailor. So for me, storytelling also starts from home, and just doing the simple things like mending your clothes, doing this. Like it's a simple thing, but it kind of tells a story that this is something that is of value, and I'm not going to throw it away just because it's done. It's something that can be fixed, and it can be worn by you and other people that you want to give it to. So for me, storytelling, as I mentioned, is more than just let's say writing or photography or telling people why it's important. For me, storytelling is showing, and just showing up and being practical and showing why are we doing this, and why is it important that everyone takes it up, just to be able to understand that loving and caring goes a long way, even when it comes to clothes that actually everyone wears in the world and everyone relates to this, but they just don't want to understand that it's important that we really look into what we're doing at the end of our purchase and what we're doing with it.
Great, Janet. Thank you so much. And I think you both already did such a good job covering the ins and outs, but I think I'll just quickly discuss what we're doing at 30 and Change from the storytelling component. So this goes back to when I attended the climate conference and I was seeing the people that were up on that stage. They were up there because they were so-called leaders in the industry, but really they were the ones that had the most profit and was able to go there. A lot of these conferences, whether it's COP, whether it's, other COP conferences by the UN, or even just conferences in general, are largely inaccessible to a point where the exact voices we need to be hearing from, such as garment workers, are not represented. We had the absolute pleasure of interviewing Nazreen, who is a survivor of modern day slavery. And she said that some of the people I've spoken to before from industry wouldn't even look me in the eye, because I have worked with the factories where they were exploiting me. And they turn a blind eye, but it's uncomfortable because this is a real human being story. And for us, that's why storytelling is so important, so incredibly powerful. And instead of being super negative and talking about how much of these brands have a bad story, we decided to channel the energy into showcasing the stories of those that are really leading the way, who are exemplary. And that's where Global Innovation Storymap comes in. Right now, we have over 50 brands on the map from all around the world. And these have gone through a dedicated vetting process through 30 and Change. And the goal of this map is to really promote three main things: authenticity, transparency, and also vulnerability. Understanding that there is room to fill. Like there's brands here who previously were not sustainable brands or even ethical brands, and now they have really transformed, whether they're now 1% certified, be for the planet, they have ongoing different labor practices auditing, or they have now adopted an all-entire woman board that are advising them on different practices. And for us, is these stories of these brands are really deserving of being at these global conferences and talks. 30 and Change does have a presence at these global conferences, and we hope to bring these stories of these brands that are really doing the right thing, to showcase through a storytelling format, whether it's through digital, video, podcasts, how these bigger brands can really learn something. And something else is some of these bigger brands are really good at crafting a careful narrative of showcasing how well they're doing. But at the end of the day, the supply chain is still riddled with lots of greenwashing. And the best example I can think of that is when it comes to scoring on emissions reduction targets, and also scoring on if they have long-term and short-term emissions reductions targets. Brands like MEC, Mountain Equipment Co-op, and Patagonia and Lululemon score lower than Nike. And these are all outdoor apparel brands that have really showcase and they have consumers that buy their products because they're seen as green, because they're promoting outdoorism, being in nature, when the reality is when it comes to supply chain, a brand like Nike is doing better. So you really have to think and understand that there's so many different aspects of fashion. Like modern slavery is one thing, but there's also supply chain, there's a value chain. This is what happened to the clothes after. Do they have a take back program? And are they using circular materials? It's a really, really complicated process, but it's with our hope that through some of our talks today, we can help you better understand that. And there's also other resources on our website as well that also dives deeper into these components. So next question is kind of a long one, so I'm just going to try to shorten it. So it's basically we hear the word circularity being used a lot. It was kind of the buzzword in circular economy and also sustainable fashion. So what can industry leaders and also brands do to ensure that they achieve circularity? So seeing that waste is not just considered after the clothing has gone to waste, like after we're going to donate it or get rid of it, but also how we can design waste out at the beginning. And how can we revolutionize the way we think about fashion at any given point in the supply chain? Namrita, Janet, do you want to start? And then I can take it from there.
I could go unless Janet wants to. I think it's very important that companies and factories, they take responsibility for all the waste that they create in the manufacturing process itself. They have to change their business model to be such that they are responsible for the waste they create, because that's, at the moment it's somebody else's responsibility, either the government or another agency or, another country where they dump it. I think the system has to be such that anything you create, you have to be responsible. Either you find a way to dispose it or you find a way to clean it or to use it. So that's one thing for sure. And the other thing is in the designing process itself, with where technology is, we can essentially a lot of the waste is coming from the traditional manufacturing processes, and I think with the kind of advancements we have, from how much water gets wasted to how much fabric gets wasted to what kind of resources are used, I think there can be a big revolution in this industry itself in terms of just using clean energy and more efficient ways to protect the resources we're using, so that circularity shouldn't even be an issue. If you solve the problem at grassroots and you're not really creating issues, then you don't have to worry about them later. So that's my take on it. Janet, you want to jump in?
I can jump in next because I just looking at time, there's a few questions I want to get through. So for this one, I just want to say, even the term circular economy is a Western term, and it's definitely gotten a lot more airtime in the recent years, especially because last year we were a panelist at the World Circular Economic Forum. Especially indigenous folks and many BIPOC communities have been practicing this concept of circular economy and circularity for generations, for eons. Like a personal example is I remember my mom would always save the kimchi jars, or she would save the yogurt containers, we put our chopsticks in them. And now it's marketable, now it's cool. And now you have zero waste stores popping up selling mason jars with like a nice straw. So it's interesting. And I think it's no different in fashion. I think we have to recognize when it comes to circular economy, are we thinking of it from the lens where it's going to be something that is going to work for everybody? Or is it how we thought about circularity in the previous context, where it's mostly the Global South produces it, and then they're also our dumping ground? So I think we definitely need to consider the fact that even this terminology of Global South, Global North, in some ways is detrimental. At our panel on Monday, where the panel was called Fashion in the Global South, we had an amazing panelist from India, Kirti Puna, who is currently, she made one of the largest second-hand resale websites and platforms in India. And she was saying, to me, I don't even think about it as the Global South, because this is my land, this is where I'm from, this is my worldview. So even the way that the fashion industry is operating, where we're using the Global South as a dumping ground, is inherently problematic. And there's a lot of things that we not only have to learn, but also unlearn. So like we mentioned previously, a lot of this focus is on post-consumer. We have to think about the pre. So circular materials is one thing, but how can we encourage secondhand usage? The revitalization of vintage, that's not gentrified, because there's a lot of that happening as well with the gentrification of thrifting and prices going up exponentially. But more so, I think a lot of what we need to do, and a brand that we're currently working with, or one of our clients, ecologists, they're great. I think they do a really good job at helping people understand the actual processing. Lisa spoke earlier at the panel, Local Brands, at noon today. And Ecologist has a program where you can go into their showroom and they give you tours on how the clothing is made, how it's processed, what machines are used, the name of the machines, what happens to it afterwards. And I think it's when we have this personal relationship with clothing, where we see it as stories instead of just commodities, that's when we can really look into change our relationship with clothing and ultimately find ways to practice circularity in that sense, instead of just from a consumer perspective. And the last question kind of ties into the first audience question that is asked. So I'm just going to quickly go to the next one. And this is not as wordy as the last one. What does justice look like for people working in the fashion industry? And I'm ready to have you go first.
Maybe Janet can go first this time.
I think. Janet, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
I dropped, but I'm back now. Yeah, so I think I'm going to speak about it from the way I have seen it. So last year I spent a lot of time looking at ethical and sustainable brands, and one thing I noticed is that they were very transparent about the process that their clothing takes. They showed where they got the materials from, the kind of dyes that they use, where they do all the prep and the production and all of that. But the one thing that they didn't show was, I mean, yes, they showed who made their clothes, but they didn't really get into the details of how do we determine how they are paid, and their working conditions as well. So like for me, I think it's important that in as much as we really want to show the environmental implications of our brand, but it's also important that they actually show the people that they work with. And it's not enough to show us that this is the person that made it. We also want to see how are their rights considered? How are you paying them? Like, we just you don't have to like go to the point of where you're telling us their actual wages, but just try to break down how do you arrive at their wages. So I think that's, for me, that's one of the ways that justice can be brought out for people working in the fashion industry.
Fantastic, Janet. Thank you. Nom, anything you want to add? If not, I can also take this one.
I just want to add that I think this is more like a dream for the fashion industry than, you know, an immediate step that could be taken. But I think just coming back to what you were saying about circularity, I think for me, what justice will look like is when, you know, the companies that exist in the Western world, like the North, the global North that we call, you know, actually start investing in the places where, like, all of their, I mean, let's just stick to the fashion industry. So where all of the clothes are made. So the people who are providing you the thing that with which you make your bread and butter, they should invest in, you know, cleaning those places more rather than, you know, dirtying them. And, you know, just making conditions for people to breathe better, to live better, you know, like wages are so secondary to just basic clean air and clean water. You know, I mean, just the kind of conditions you live in and you work in, it's very unfair compared to, I mean, I've moved from India to Vancouver to do my MBA, and, you know, I still haven't ever suffered the things that so many people in India have suffered. And yet I find such a contrast. Like, I feel like my lungs are alive now, you know, and I don't know what I've been living for the last 30 years or something. So, you know, and just thinking about the conditions that people who are not as fortunate as me live, you know, it's unimaginable. So I think that would be justice, yeah. If, you know, if everything in the whole world is, yeah, equally clean, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point, Amrita. And to build on that, there's an amazing film called River Blue by the director Roger Williams. We had him speak during our Fashion Revolution events last April. And his film really dives into the pollution of rivers and ecosystem in Bangladesh, you know, all the clear cutting and crops going away in many regions to grow more cotton, clear cutting forests to grow cotton for clothing production. And a lot of what he's saying is that there's people who are born into conditions where they cannot breathe properly. And this is not even just Bangladesh, it's happening in Sri Lanka, in Vietnam, in Philippines, in Indonesia, a lot of places in Southeast Asia, and they're producing most of our jeans and the rest of our clothing. And I think to build on that, a big injustice I feel in the fashion industry, being a woman of color, having founded this organization, is a lot of times when I step into a room, I don't see many people like myself, Janet, and Amrita in those spaces. And when we are in those spaces, we're oftentimes tokenized. But what's even more interesting is sometimes when you think of fashion, there's a girly connotation for fashion. Like it's a woman's world. That's what people think, is because maybe it's because of the fashion models, or it's just seen as fashion's girly, I suppose. But what's really disheartening about that is out of the top 10 fashion companies in the world in terms of profit, so I'm talking about Zara, H&M, Nike, Adidas, Uniqlo, Louis Vuitton, Hermes, Chanel, only one CEO is female, and that's Helena from H&M. But out of these top 10 companies, 2 out of 10 of them are billionaires, which are both men, CEOs of Zara and also Louis Vuitton. So one out of the 5 of the top 10 billionaires in the world is in the fashion industry, and it's all men. So if it's such a girly industry, how come none of us are in positions of power? How come it's always women, and a woman of color at that, mainly working in these factories? And there's a lot of generational trauma being passed down as well with these women all across the world. There's people who have grown up in the fashion factory in Bangladesh their whole life. And a lot of the jobs possessed by women who are government workers in the United States are also women of color, 98% in fact. So when we think about this lens of the fashion industry, there is so much injustice persistent in how the systems are currently in place. And that's a lot of the exploitation of women's bodies, the wage gap that exists, and also the fact that we don't even have access to clean drinking water, and also who is represented at these discussion tables and decision-making tables. When I first presented in my first slide, it's mostly people from Europe and also America. And with that, I'm gonna go into the first audience question we have in our last 5 minutes. And this is a really great question. And Clara asks, how do you think fashion activism can challenge the fundamental business and economic principles that are ultimately the highest cause of fashion's social and ecological problems in a world that is hesitant to talk about global systems change? I like that. So how can we use fashion activism to challenge, to uphold system change and challenge the global lack of system change? Nam or Janet, do you want to take a stab at it first?
Sure, I could go. I would say everybody is a consumer, first of all. So if people are investing time and effort in things like activism, it just means that more people are, you know, thinking the right way and taking the right steps. And I think that's something that can only grow organically. You know, you can't force people to be passionate about something. So, you know, it's very voluntary, you know, changing your own behavior and changing your own patterns and coming out of your comfort zone. So I think just seeing other people be passionate about it and, you know, hearing their stories, I think, again, it ties in with the storytelling. You know, when it makes sense to you, then you want to do it. And hopefully, like, you, at least one of you will go back today and, you know, might want to change something. And that's how it all starts. You know, activism doesn't have to be, you know, going out with banners and, you know, just making, like, displaying your displeasure with the industry. It's about making personal changes in your own life. You know, you're kind of in an activism mode with yourself, I guess, you know. So yeah, that's my take on it. Great question.
Yeah, and to build on Amrita's point. Oh, sorry, Jan, you go first. I will go after you.
Okay, so I agree with Nam. The one thing that we all have in common is clothes. So, and as you've mentioned that not everyone can be an activist or is interested in being an activist, but there are a lot of amazing activists around. And I think for me, the first step is just being interested in like what, or caring about where or the impacts that your habits have on both people and the planet. And so with that, as you have mentioned, you don't really have to be at the front line actively talking about it, but there are simple ways that you can participate in activism by, for example, looking into the brands that you're buying from, if you really need to buy that. And also just from your phone, you can ask this brands to be more transparent. And yeah, I feel like there's a lot we can do, but like we really don't have to go deep into it, but like just asking or being more mindful of our consumption habits and the brands that we buy from.
Great, Janet. I totally agree. That's such a good point. And I also just posted in the chat some amazing fashion activists that you can check out. And there's many women of color as well to support. Aja Barber is a great example who spoke yesterday. And I guess I'm going to end off this question and also the panel today was just saying that I get asked this question a lot, personally and also professionally, like, what can I do? Like, you got me so riled up, like fashion is terrible, blah, blah. And I hear a lot of people say, buy less, shop secondhand, don't buy new. And I challenge that. Like, I think, like, why do we have to buy anything new in the first place? A lot of us already have so many pieces of clothing, especially for us, living in Canada, coming from immense places of privilege. You don't have to buy something. You don't have to buy anything. And that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek quote that I heard. It's like, sustainable fashion, there's the first thing you can do is be naked or just don't buy anything new. And what we have traditionally heard, even from the 70s, reduce, reuse, recycle, the 3 R's. And it's interesting because when we think of that in terms of paper, plastic, metal cans, but how come we haven't thought about that in fashion? How come we're just talking about fashion recycling, textile recycling now? So I challenge everyone here to forget those 3 R's, and I'm gonna have some new 3 R's for you, and that's rewear, repurpose, rethink. So, and instead of, reduce, reuse, recycle, rewear what you already have. Like, I've worn this many times. Repurpose what you have, making this something new, and rethink the broken systems that we currently exist in. It's interesting, at least in the case of Vancouver, when they closed down gyms, right? But then malls are still open and you could still go and have this consumerism activity and do all these things, shop till you drop almost in a way. And it's thrown at us, as Aja said yesterday, to just consume and buy more things. And now with Instagram marketing and influencer marketing, there's so many examples of when it's so easy to buy something. But I urge you to resist that. That's another R. Rethink the current system you are in and how you fit into the realm of society and how you can challenge that by not buying anything. And it's like by supporting some of these brands and organizations that are doing the right thing. Or Storymap is a great example of that. Or you could buy from brands that have been traditionally vetted and they have gone through a criteria where they're doing the right thing. Research, that's another R I'm going to throw at you. And with that, thank you so much to our panelists for joining, and thank you all of you for being here today and joining our talk. We're currently actually hiring for a few different paid and also volunteer positions. If you're interested, if you liked what we talked about today, if you like Threading Change's work, if it intrigues you, feel free to go to the link here, which is bit.ly/TC Jobs Board. Our team is pretty global. We have people from Netherlands, from Kenya, Brazil, Sri Lanka on our team, and we're also working very locally. So think global, act local is kind of our mantra. So if you're interested, you can check out the link there. We can also send a post-event email. We're also currently in middle of a fundraiser, so this needs to be updated. We're almost at the 2,500 mark, so we appreciate you help us a little bit more so we can keep getting and doing these programs for all of you for free. And we would love to keep the conversation growing. Here's our different social links. We're threading change on pretty much everything. We like to keep up to date. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an amazing discussion. Tomorrow, we have another panel at 5 p.m. Pacific called Youth in Fashion, which we're introducing to you 3 amazing young people who have their own brands, who have made materials out of recycled goods that are really leading the way and changing the fashion game. And there's also 2 other events happening on Friday. One is a closed mini workshop that Tim posted earlier, and there's also a panel on Think Global, Act Local, which will also be really interesting. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we wish you a great rest of the evening.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you. Bye.